Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Indaba Africa. This is Chris coming to you from central Pennsylvania. Special greetings to those in southern Africa, in particular in Namibia. This video is about Air Namibia and the proposed liquidation of the southern African country's national carrier. On the 4th of June 2020, President Hage Geingob called for the liquidation of Air Namibia. Now, the carrier had suspended all flights owing to the pandemic going on around the globe, which has crippled revenue generation. So with no revenue, a large debt load, high operating cost, and few prospects with the global pandemic hysteria being the order of the day for the uninformed and science-denying politicians the world over, Air Namibia is in desperate straits. As a consequence, the president made the rational comment that the airline should be liquidated. But the carrier's problems long predate the current pandemic. One example of this is in June of 2019, Air Namibia's Airbus A319s were grounded owing to a cash shortfall as a result of a 25 million euro claim from the liquidator of a defunct Belgian carrier known as Challenge Air. As a consequence, 3 of the 4 A319s were grounded because the airline didn't have money to pay for maintenance. At the time, one of the planes was stuck in Larnaca, Cyprus, and 2 of them were stuck at OR Tambo in Johannesburg, South Africa. So only 1 aircraft was actually in Namibia that they could actually operate. And owing to the fact that they didn't have the money, they had to ground these aircraft. They couldn't operate them. Now, Air Namibia has 9 or 10 aircraft, depending on who you believe here, but this is a very small fleet. So it has 2 A330-200s, those are the flagship aircraft of the fleet, and then 4 Embraer E135s. So they fly, these 10 aircraft fly to 16 destinations with 11 daily flights before the current pandemic. A little bit of history on Air Namibia. Its origins are in the private sector, not as a state-owned enterprise. And it traces its lineage back to November of 1946 when Southwest Air Transport, or SWAT, was formed. The airline focused on domestic routes. I chuckle because SWAT is Special Weapons and Tactics, which is a police organization. So that just kind of reminds me of a 1970s television show, SWAT. Anyway, the airline focused on domestic routes as a private enterprise. In 1959, SWAT merged with a company called Oryx to form Southwest Airways. In 78, Southwest Airways merged into Namibia Air, and the government became the major shareholder of Namibia Air in 1982. So since 1982, it has essentially been a state-owned enterprise. And it was finally renamed Air Namibia in October of 1991 after Namibia gained its independence and was no longer called Southwest Africa. Now, like Air Botswana and South African Airways next door, Air Namibia is a state-owned enterprise, as I mentioned, with its main hub at the Hosea Kutaka International Airport, which is located 45 kilometers from Windhoek. Yes, 45 kilometers. I know this only too well. As I recall, about 20 years ago, leaving Windhoek, heading back to the airport, looking for petrol stations to make sure that I wasn't charged for not having a full tank, filling up the last petrol station available, driving the 45 kilometers out to the airport, and then later being charged by the rental car company for my hire an outrageous sum of something like $3 per gallon for a couple of gallons of fuel, which I couldn't buy because there was no petrol station for the public at the airport, which is located 45 kilometers. Now, why is the airport located so far? Because Windhoek is surrounded by mountains and there's no optimal location to do it. So the airport's about 45 kilometers away. Now, that's the airport for its international flights. It's its hub, its headquarters, but also it relies on another airport nearby known as Aros, and Aros is for domestic flights. So what are the prospects for Air Namibia? Well, with the president calling for liquidation, is privatization in order? This isn't the first time that privatization has been raised or floated as a concept. Back in 2019, Lufthansa, Ethiopian, and even the basket case South African Airways all expressed interest in buying the carrier. But the problem is that the current debt load is at least $295 million. Analysts project that it would cost at least $500 million US to get the airline through this financial year. And they have already eaten through $540 million in state bailouts. Hence the reason why the president is interested in liquidating the airline. Who wants to invest in a tiny carrier with that kind of debt, operating expenses, and one that has not disclosed financial results for well over a decade? You can't take a company seriously if they can't be bothered to produce their financial results to share their balance sheet with investors or with the public. Over a decade since they last released financials. Now, nonetheless, Namibia is a physically large country that needs civil aviation. So Air Namibia is the only domestic commercial carrier. and neither South African Airways or Air Botswana are positioned or even capable of adequately serving Namibia's domestic market. So that creates a serious problem here for Namibia and for Namibians seeking to travel inside the country, or for those who are tourists who come to Namibia who want to travel around. Without a commercial carrier, this is problematic for such a large country. Windhoek would do well to make other things friendly in the sector for airlines, for either a re-emerged Air Namibia or for other operators who would like to operate in the country commercially. So some of the things that they can do to make the market friendly for airlines would be things like easing business, easing the cost of doing business. So you could reduce registration operating cost. You could forego taxation for a decade to allow investors to get an airline profitable before they have to start paying taxes. Just one idea there. Permit foreign ownership and also seek partnerships with established sound actors like Lufthansa, Brussels Air, or Ethiopian Airlines. And finally, the government should work with the domestic and international tourism industry to promote ties and arrangements between commercial carriers and the tourism industry in Namibia. All of these things would go a long way towards making a future commercial carrier inside Namibia profitable and feasible. Now, the partnership with the tourism industry and with these established, well-run international partners would give the airline, the domestic airline, an opportunity to partner so that it could meet the full service needs of its customers. So say you're from Namibia and you need to fly outside the country, but there's no Namibian carrier like Air Namibia that flies outside the country. You could nonetheless say, for instance, if there's a local airline that flew domestically that comes out of this crisis, they could have a code-sharing arrangement with Lufthansa or with Brussels or with Ethiopian, for example, that would allow them to book on their flights and be part of that same customer base. So there are advantages to doing that. Now, to encourage tourism, Windhoek should remove taxes, fees, and duties on aviation fuel for domestic operators all over the country. This would encourage and would certainly help airlines find the market to be more attractive if they weren't paying aviation fuel. Now, before someone says, but that's the government's right to tax. Well, sure, it's the government's right to tax, but is it prudent? If you have no civil aviation, no commercial aviation airline business in Namibia and people can't fly from place to place, then you're not getting any money from tax revenue. So since Air Namibia will be liquidated, most likely, and there won't be a commercial carrier, if another commercial carrier comes along, you're not losing revenue because you weren't making the revenue. So allow them to become profitable and let people use aircraft to get around the country. Now, it is refreshing to see Namibia's president making a rational choice, unlike his neighbor to the south, that's decided that stealing the public's money is more important than coming up with solutions for the marketplace. But what comes next for Namibia? Namibia does need commercial aviation and air transport around the country, and it also needs it internationally. Now, internationally, the country is served by a number of carriers, as I mentioned, Lufthansa and others who come into the country, Ethiopian, many other airlines who actually fly into Windhoek. So people can get to Namibia, but getting around Namibia, other than hiring a contract flight or a charter flight, is difficult. So Namibia will need a domestic commercial carrier of some sort, if not more than one. I don't know if the market could bear more than one, but certainly at least one carrier. And whether that's a Phoenix-like re-emerging Air Namibia or it's another entity altogether, whatever the case may be, I urge the government of Namibia to learn the lesson from this failed enterprise, state-owned enterprise. While it's not nearly quite the disaster that South African Airways is, nonetheless, the temptation to have a national carrier owned by the state makes it all too easy to take advantage of the airline and use it for political purposes. So my recommendation is to stay out of the business of aviation and allow a commercial, privately held carrier operate in Namibia, and perhaps more if the market bears that. Do not get involved in state-owned enterprises in this sector again, and take the advice of the president of Namibia and liquidate Air Namibia. It's a small airline, just a handful of aircraft, a handful of employees, a handful of destinations, but it is important to Namibia and to Namibians who need to travel. So ladies and gentlemen, that's my thoughts on the liquidation of Air Namibia, the proposed liquidation of this small carrier from southwestern Africa. If you found this video interesting and you're not a subscriber, I ask that you consider subscribing by smashing that subscription button right down there. Be sure to toggle that bell icon because only about 25 or 30% of people do. And if you don't toggle the bell icon and say all notifications, you won't be notified of future videos and live streams. If you want to leave comments, I try to read all comments, positive or negative. If you agree or disagree, feel free to comment. And finally, I ask that you smash that like button right down there because likes drive viewership. The more likes one gets, the more videos are watched. Thank you so much for your time. Take care.